when suddenly a great storm of rain burst from the heavens, ending their shortage of water in a way that had not been foreseen. At one point, when the road could not be traced because of the sand dunes, the guide pointed out to the king that the crows cawing on the right were calling their attention to the route which led to the temple. Alexander took this as an omen, and thinking that the god was pleased by his visit, pushed on with speed.
To the Egyptians, Ammon was the equivalent of the Greek god Zeus, the king of all gods. Frequently, the deity would be addressed using both names, Zeus Ammon. Alexander has a burning desire to find out from the oracle at Siwa if he is a son of God. Today, the remains of the temple still stand at Siwa Oasis.
Alexander and his companions climbed up into the temple, and it was here on these steps that the high priest greeted Alexander with a slip of the tongue. He meant to say, "O Pai Dion, O my son." But his Greek wasn't up to much, and what the Macedonians heard him say was, "O Pai Dios, O son of Zeus." Now for Alexander that was quite a good start. The sayings of the oracle were usually delivered in this courtyard, but Alexander was too important a guest for a public show. Besides, he had some very private questions, so he alone was allowed to question the god directly and enter the inner chamber. This is the holy shrine where the bejeweled statue of the ram-headed god Ammon was kept. Alexander stood here alone on this very spot to ask his questions. He never revealed what they were, but in later years they were said to be these. Would he conquer the world? Had all his father's murderers been punished? And was he indeed the son of Zeus? Alexander received his answers from the priests, who, supposedly, had not heard the questions. But in fact, beside this chamber is a narrow passageway. Here, the priests could listen in and then appear to give the gods answers. Now, it's easy for us to mock this as a fraud, but remember, oracles don't last for 2,000 years unless they're pretty accurate. The answers that Alexander received were these. Yes, he would conquer the world. Yes, all his father's murderers had been punished, which may have been a relief to Alexander. If he was in fact guilty of involvement in his father's death, he needed to know if divine retribution was on the way. The answer to the final question was clear. The priests told him that Philip was not his father anyway, and that he was indeed the son of Zeus Ammon, the son of God.
No one is with Alexander when the priests at Siwa supposedly acknowledge him as the Son of God. There are no witnesses, only the word of Alexander himself. But as Alexander heads back through the desert to rejoin his army, his belief in his own invincibility is heightened. He would need every bit of this confidence in the months and years ahead. Alexander still faces a decisive battle with perhaps the only other mortal who might have considered himself a deity, Darius. And the Persian king is preparing a secret weapon for their next encounter, designed to render Alexander's most powerful war machine, the phalanx, useless. Fall 331 BC. Despite dramatic victories at the Granicus River, Issus, and Tyre, Alexander the Great realizes he can never claim to rule Asia if King Darius remains free. And Darius realizes he will never retain control of Asia without defeating Alexander. The two commanders know an ultimate showdown must take place. Darius chooses the location, camping his forces at the river Bomelos, near the village of Gaugamela. None of Alexander's battles is better documented by ancient historians than the Battle of Gaugamela.
Darius assembled his forces and made everything ready for battle. He had fashioned swords and lances much longer than his earlier types. He had also constructed 200 scythe-bearing chariots, well designed to astonish and terrify the enemy. From each of these were projected out, beyond the trace horses, scythes nearly 1 meter in length, presenting their cutting edges to the front.
The night before the battle, several miles of rolling hills separate the two armies. Alexander's chief general Parmenio and several of his most prominent officers move forward to survey the enemy position.
They were filled with amazement at the sight and remarked to one another that it would have been a very difficult task to defeat an enemy of such strength by engaging him by day. They therefore went to Alexander to persuade him to attack by night, so as to conceal from his men the most terrifying element in the coming struggle, that is, the odds against them. It was then that Alexander gave him his celebrated answer: "I will not steal my victory." He was determined that if Darius were defeated, he should have no cause to summon up courage for another attempt. He was not to be allowed to blame darkness and night for his failure on this occasion, as at Issus he had blamed the narrow mountain passes and the sea.
And there is this account of how he sat there at night into the darkness, figuring out strategy and tactics, finally got what he wanted, and this is the point, then just fell into a totally undisturbed sleep. And he slept on. And he said, till I got it figured out, I was worried. After that, I was fine. The army got up in the morning, the valley was sounded. Alexander slept on like a baby until finally his staff officers had to wake him.
At this point, Alexander gives his troops the pep talk of their lives, confidently telling them that this battle would decide who would rule the continent of Asia. On the other side of the battlefield, the Persian king Darius is giving a speech of his own. But his mood is more of desperation than of confidence. He tells his troops, "Today will consolidate or terminate an empire greater than any age has seen. Now, it is not glory for which you must fight, it is survival. Our backs are to the wall. I beg you by our country's gods, deliver the Persian people and its honor from the depths of disgrace."
Slowly but methodically, Alexander's phalanx marches forward in formation to encounter Darius's new rolling weapons.
The scythed chariots swung into action at full gallop and created great alarm and terror among the Macedonians. As the phalanx joined shields, however, all beat upon their shields with their spears as the king had commanded, and a great din arose. In some instances, the horses were killed by javelin casts, and in others they rode through and escaped. But some of them, using the full force of their momentum and applying their steel blades actively, wrought death among the Macedonians in many and various forms. They severed the arms of many, shields and all, and in no small number of cases, cut through necks and sent heads tumbling to the ground with the eyes still open and the expression of the countenance unchanged. In other cases, they sliced through ribs with mortal gashes and inflicted a quick death.
Facing a king and his army, fighting with superhuman strength and passion to retain control of Asia, Alexander's soldiers find themselves, for the first time, struggling not to win, but simply to survive. The situation looks horribly bleak for the Macedonian general Parmenio, who heroically attempts to maintain order in a valiant struggle with his infantry. He realizes there is only one person who has the capacity to turn the tide of battle: Alexander himself. but Alexander is preoccupied, personally fighting his way toward the chariot bearing King Darius.
Alexander has sighted his adversary through the ranks of cavalry, who were closely massed to guard the lofty chariot in which he stood. The bravest stood fast and were slaughtered in front of their king. They fell upon one another in heaps. As for Darius, all the horrors of the battle were now before his eyes. It had become difficult to turn his chariot around and drive it away, since the wheels were encumbered and entangled with bodies. The king abandoned his chariot and his armor, mounted a mare and rode away. It is believed that he would not have escaped at the moment had not Parmenius sent another party of horsemen, begging Alexander to come to his rescue.
When this news was brought to Alexander, he turned back again from further pursuit, and wheeling round with the companion cavalry, led them with great speed against the right wing of Darius' horsemen. Then ensued the most obstinately contested cavalry fight in the whole engagement. Here about 60 of Alexander's companions fell, but Darius' troops were overcome by Alexander, and as many of them as could force their way through his ranks fled with all their might.
What may have first appeared to be impending doom for Alexander proves to be yet another episode confirming Alexander's genius as a commander. Realizing that Darius is relying not on his infantry, but massed squadrons of heavily armed horsemen, Alexander tempts both of Darius' cavalry wings to charge his echelon flanks. Alexander hopes that the flanks can hold out just long enough to create a gap in the Persian line, allowing Alexander's companion cavalry to punch through, which they do with perfect timing. Historians past and present consider the strategy masterful.
Alexander had a tactical brilliance there. The only thing that one can perhaps criticize is that he left the battlefield in pursuit of Darius, trying to get hold of him alive.
Alexander wheels around and starts off in pursuit of Darius once more, keeping up the chase as long as there is daylight. Parmenio's brigade also follows, but when darkness falls, Alexander stops to rest his men and horses. Darius continues to ride away, leaving behind his chariot, spear, and bow. Again, Darius escapes.
Although the Macedonian army is grossly outnumbered, the casualty figures reported by historians are nothing short of astounding. Some say incredible.
Of Alexander's men, about 100 were killed, and more than 1,000 of his horses were lost, either from wounds or from fatigue in the pursuit. Of Darius' forces, there were said to have been 300,000 slain, and far more were taken prisoner than were killed.
The Battle of Gaugamela leaves no doubt that Persia is now under Alexander's control. But of far greater importance for the warrior king is the capture of King Darius. Alexander knows Darius will be far more valuable governing Persia under his command than as a deceased ruler. But would he be able to capture